Hello, welcome to this video. I'm just driving down my studio today, and I thought I'd do a little introduction to what's going on today. I really wanted to explore the idea of jazz composition. Often when we talk about jazz, we focus on the improvisational aspects, the soloing aspects, whereas I think that with jazz artists, what makes a jazz artist as opposed to just a jazz musician is the fact that they compose, and this is often not considered when we think of great instrumentalists. So for example, if we were thinking of, guitarists like Alan Holdsworth or Aldo Meola or John McLaughlin, for example, a great part of what they do are their compositions. So I thought what would be a good way to explore this for an audience to see how this worked was to bring in today two of my favourite jazz composers that I know. One being Chanaan Hanspal, who you may know from his YouTube of the same name, where he explores the compositional approaches of people like Frank Zappa, but a really interesting composer, and I would say much closer to we could call it the funky fusion end of jazz composition. Another great composer, I believe, is the alto saxophone player Martin Speake, a friend of this channel. So I thought, wouldn't it be great to bring up them two to work together, so they have to be both sideman and leader. And on all of this, I am literally just a sideman. So this is quite a difficult task. Chan has brought up a composition of his. No one's really heard it before, so we were playing from charts completely. I didn't let anybody really hear the compositions till the night before, so that the process would have to be pulled together before your very eyes. And also Martin will be bringing up a composition that we will all be playing. So that's the idea, and hopefully I will be able to showcase these two incredible musicians, and you'll feel the desire and motivation to go and check them out, and maybe even buy some product from them, which will be very gratifying for me, because in the end that is what it's all about. So let's jump into my studio and see what's going on.
What's the order of the solos? What would you like?
You
first.
Yeah.
Get it over with, yeah. The fourth note is long. I think you're playing it short, Wendy. I'm being
Which
really
one?
fussy here. The A flat. Oh, I'm sorry.
The session is over. It's all quiet in here. The musicians have all gone home, and I have just been setting up a mix and starting to mix the audio off so that you can hear it recorded in a reasonable fashion. And what I would like to do on this video is to go through the compositions that Chanaan and Martin brought in, and have a conversation about how jazz composition works. And I want this discussion to hopefully be of interest for non-musicians. A lot of the time with jazz, many people who are listening to it find it incomprehensible, because there's quite a set of rules with jazz, you see, and those set of rules shift around. So I'm hoping what we could do here is we could talk a little bit about what we played, and I will talk through how the composition works and how the composition relates to improvisation, and also the personalities involved and the dynamics. And as you can see on the thumbnail is titled, "Is This Any Good?", which I think was the feeling that the musicians had in the room whilst they were doing these sessions. At least I hope they did, because that was the feeling I wanted to instill in them. Because although I wasn't bringing in compositions for this video, what I was doing was producing it. And in producing it, I was trying to put the musicians into a certain place where they would react in a certain way. And I'd like to try and explain what my intentions were there as well. So The first tune I am going to show to you is actually a jazz standard. It's the jazz standard Stella by Starlight. Now, of course, this is a song, this is a composition, but it's really just a song. And it was a pop song from the 1940s. And I think it was from a film. I'm not sure which film it was off the top of my head. But the point is, this is a pop song that jazz musicians throughout history have taken and have utilised to build improvisations from. So, and this is really the fundamental way that jazz musicians improvise. This is the starting point, although there's lots of other ways of improvising. But basically, what you have is you have the tune. And if you imagine the melody of the tune, once you've gone through and played that melody, you then go back to the beginning of the melody and you go through it again, but the lead soloist doesn't play the tune. They play their own tune, which corresponds with the tune that's already there, although it's not there anymore. So for non-musicians, when they sort of come to the end and then they come back to the beginning and someone steps forward and starts soloing, if you sing the tune through, you will suddenly be able to hear all the sort of counterpoint movement that the lead soloist is making. And that's a really good place to start with understanding what musicians are doing. Now, with these old pop songs, of course, how many people can sing Stella by Starlight off the top of their heads now? And this is one of the big reasons why audience find jazz difficult now. Obviously, back in the 1940s, people knew the tune very well, and they would have been able to hear the tune as they played it. But now, you have to learn the tune and know how it goes. Now, if you're playing through that tune, the tune may be a certain amount of bars long. Now, bars, when you're counting, it's every 4 beats a bar passes. So we're chopping up the song into these chunks. They're called bars. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then the next bar. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the next bar. And music often follows a 4 or 8 bar cycle. In the blues, it's famous for following a 12 bar cycle, which is a little bit different, but it is only 3 lots of 4 bars. Right? Now, as you go through that tune, in each bar, there could be 1, 2, maybe 3 chords, usually 1 or 2, which are supporting the tune. The chords are underneath, providing the harmony on which the tune sits. Now, the way a jazz musician improvises is that they think about that harmony, that chord in that bar, and they utilise notes that they know fit really nicely with that chord to create their own new tune. Now, this is exactly how a composer would compose. They would think, oh, here's a D minor chord, and here's some nice notes, and I will organise that into a nice tune. And if you've got some lyrics, you might think, well, what's the phrase of the word? You know, and then you would come up with a phrase that fits that rhythmical structure. So that's basically what's going on. Now, we're going at this a little bit different because, of course, when you're a jazz musician, you play through a jazz standard. You don't have to obey the speed of it or the style of it or the rhythms that you play. We can change all that because it's not just the lead soloist that is improvising. Within the structure, the rest of the band is improvising. So the bass player can play whatever they want as long as they're providing the fundamental sort of harmonic structure underneath. So they could play the root note of a chord that the lead soloist is playing, but they might play something else. But much more importantly is that they can improvise rhythmically. The chordal accompaniment, which is coming in this case from Fi and Wendy, they know their harmony, so they can substitute other chords for the chords that are there. Or play little turnarounds. And that makes it very interesting. And of course, me as a drummer, I can provide different rhythms, different hits, and I can respond rhythmically to what the soloist is doing. Now, with this particular session, I went in to cause a little bit of trouble. So I am continually trying with my drumming to upset the apple cart. I'm continually going over here and over there, and sometimes I'm in time and sometimes I'm out of time. And towards the end of Wendy's solo, you will hear that I go completely out of time and then I try to return into time. It'd be interesting to see if I actually did it. But if I didn't do it and I failed, then the musicians might respond and we might be able to get back into time. Now, why would you do this? Why would you want to upset the apple cart in this way? Very interesting. Answers later in the video. Anyway, what you're about to see now is our version version of Stella by Starlight. I will annotate it with words, descriptions of what I think are going on, so you can tell when the tune's finished and the solo starts, and anything that I can see which is quite interesting, I might put up to see if you notice it. And I don't think anyone's ever done this before, so I thought this could be quite interesting to try and do it with these tunes. One of the things you have to understand with jazz, one of the things I enjoy, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be right. Sometimes there's an antagonism between the musicians, or an antagonism in the music, and I believe that's actually essential to come up with something which is compelling. When I was a young lad, I became very interested in a video that I'd recorded off the TV of a program called Jazz 625, and it was a tribute to Charlie Parker, and it had got Sonny Stitt on it, and Howard McGee, Kenny Clark. Who else was on there that I can remember? Can't remember any of the other players. Now, what they'd done, the BBC had pulled up all these players in the 1960s, just 10 years after, Charlie Parker's death. So these guys still knew each other. They're all dead now. Back then, they were still playing. They were still relatively young. And of course, there's a lot of history there. And one of the things I found fascinating was watching the dynamics between the players, because they were sort of getting on each other's nerves. You could tell there was history there, and people were quite disruptive. And once I realised this, and I was watching it and listening to it, you could almost hear the arguments going on in the playing. And I thought this was fascinating. I thought jazz was supposed to be all highfalutin. I didn't realise people could get annoyed with people, or they could play jokes on people, and you could hear what the personalities were like in this group. The trumpet player, Howard McGee, seemed to be a right troublemaker that seemed to be getting right up the nose of Sonny Stitt when you watched it, Anyway, nothing like that happened, because we all love each other in this group, But I have to say, this group, this is the first time the musicians have met. I've played with Stanan, I've played with Martin, and I've played with Wendy, and I've played with Phil. But this is the first time they've all come together with this unit. We really didn't have much structure. I did this deliberately, there wasn't much structure there. We knew we were going to do Stella by Starlight, and just a day or so before, they shared charts of these tunes, which are quite tricky in a way. And so the musicianship for me is off the scale, that these people can walk in and play at this level straight off from a piece of music on a piece of paper, something I've never been able to do. A little bit about the musicians in the group. Wendy Kirkland is an artist under her own name. She sings and plays piano. She's had tons of albums out, done loads of videos. Go and check her out. And her husband is Pat Sprakes, who's a guitarist. Here he's playing 6-string electric bass and double bass on this session. So anyway, we're 11 minutes in onto this bit at least. So do you want to watch a bit of music? So here we are playing Stella by Starlight. Now, the interesting thing with that performance is everyone in that group really knows that tune. Jazz musicians really know Stella by Starlight. What is interesting is Shannon brought in that sort of funky riff. Well, once that groove was set up, we then went into the tune, adapting the jazz standard in terms of its form to fit that style. So everyone's playing in that sort of way. Martin does a lovely version of the tune at the start, and you can hear straight away he's improvising. He's not just playing the tune, but he's adding his own touches in. Poor old Martin, of course, he is in there without any electrical help. The keyboards, bass and drums are all going through amplification in the room. I'm playing a drum kit which is very loud. Martin is having to fill this with the air from his lungs. Now, all the way through, he kept saying it's getting too loud, it's getting too loud. And I kept trying to pull it back. And but in pulling it back, I wasn't able to dig into the drums to create that sense of groove. So naturally, I would let it amp up to being more funk and rock volume than to be at a sort of jazz swinging acoustic volume. And you can feel that all the time. You can feel that it's very much like it surges forward, and then I try and pull it back, and then I lose control of it and I pull it back. And that's going on all the way through the piece. When Martin's not playing, we're able to put the energy in. When Martin is playing, I also want Martin to have the energy. So there's certain points I was aware that Martin's soloing, but he cannot actually hear himself. And I'm sure at the time he was feeling, I can't hear myself. And this is where my concept for this production comes in. And I wanted to talk about this on here. When I listen back to it, there's something very, very exciting about it. It's very exciting to hear the musicians who have their own background, they used to do their own thing, being in a context where they're not quite at home. Context is really important. In the end, whoever the personalities are in that room, the overarching personality, I'm afraid, is me, because it's my YouTube channel. And I'm thinking, how am I going to make this into a video? How can I make it interesting to the audience? And what I want is for you to see something that's very rare in the modern cultural landscape. And that's musicians playing in the moment, warts and all, trying things out. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. There might be a car crash, there might not. That's what I want to show. I want to show something happening in this room that we're sat in. Now, with modern digital technology, you can fix stuff. Now, I would love to say that what you just heard on, the soundtrack to that video you just watched was completely warts and all. It wasn't. When I mixed it, as soon as you start to mix, you start to bring things forward and push things back. And that's different to what was going on in the room. Every recording is sort of fake as soon as you start to work with it. There are certain moments where I have taken a few notes out. Not because they were wrong, but just because at that moment in time, there was a lot going on. A couple of things that were slightly out of time, I've just moved a little bit. So there have been some adjustments, but what I haven't done is fix the basic integrity of what we played. It's all there. And I haven't tried to edit out where we're going down a wrong direction. Now, what do I mean by a wrong direction? You're listening to a player, it's the first time you played with that player, so you're trying to, whilst they're soloing, take in what's going on. So Martin is a very logical player, incredibly virtuoso, and he's spinning all sorts of clever stuff harmonically out. And he's also covering a lot of ground with his sound. So there's a lot going on, there's a lot happening. Very interesting. And he's providing very interesting rhythmical parts for me to react to. He's much more based upon the language of jazz, bebop especially, and Ornette Coleman, I would say. There's a lot of... There's a lot of that. He doesn't just do that, but there is a sort of rhythmical sophistication that I feel is coming from Charlie Parker. It's the innovations rhythmically that happen with bebop. Wendy as a soloist is there's a lot of chords going on, as you'd say, a lot of sort of quite modernistic shifts, and she rhythmically floats over the time a little bit more, and so there's certain points when Wendy's playing that I will try and join on what I think she's about to do, but she's actually going somewhere else, and I misjudged some of those. That was me, not her. But I have played with her before, and I felt this session I was able to catch some of the rhythmical stuff, and I actually felt that me and Wendy had a much closer rhythmical relationship going on these tracks than we have before, because I've started to understand that she often will play these rhythmical figures that I can jump onto when she's playing more block chord things. A very Dave Brubeck-esque way of playing, actually. Chanan has come out of a sort of much more fusion end of it, and he's interested in our time signatures, turning stuff upside down, and he's very interested in tuplets, as am I, polyrhythms, and he plays some incredibly heavy polyrhythms, and I need to sit down with him and jam with him, because I'm always shocked at what he's going for. I can hear them, and I tried to get some of them today, and I think I did get a couple in that recording. So that what was going on. But what I could have done, you see, I could have just grooved all the way through like a George Benson tune and just kept it really in the pocket and just let everyone play. But I wasn't. I was deliberately pushing and edging and pushing it, going out of time, back in, putting them backbeats around all over the place. And I felt that there were certain points where that dynamic, which is, I feel, between me and Chanan, which is that sort of, let's get inside and just blow this up. Let's go Stella. Stella by Starlight. Let's go like into Stella by Starlight, as it were. I recovered from that then. Let's aim for the horizon. Who cares where we're? Let's just kill it all. Let's kill us all. And so me and Chanan, I always feel like when it gets to his solo, he's like, right, come on. But some of the most out there stuff I did was at the back end of Wendy's solo. Here's quite an interesting little quirk at the end of our version of Stella by Starlight. As we come out of the piano solo, I start to move the time away from the actual pulse, and I'm playing all over the place. And I really take it far away, but actually what's happening is underneath the pulse is ticking all the time. So you have to have one part of your head keeping tabs on where the pulse is, whilst your hands are sort of flailing around into other different rhythmical realms. If you want to know how you do that, it's basically you use tuplets and polyrhythms, so you start to infer other things, and also turning the beat upside down. And there's a really out there version of this here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that was Stella by Starlight. The next tune that I'm going to show you now is a tune by Chanan Hanspel, which I think is called Manda Carallo, I think. Also, again, it's got this very funky approach to it. It's quite fast, which means it can get very frenetic. And it's got a sort of African that sort of feel to it. And the original is very funky, lots of percussion on it. You know, we haven't got the percussion here. The head is very, very complex rhythmically. You know, coming from some of the Schofield sort of heads that we heard on albums like Blue Matter and maybe things like Chromosome by Mike Stern, it's got that sort of bebop vocabulary pushed into a funky fusion end. And I had a chart there, and I needed a little bit more time with the chart if I was going to pick it up as I played. But there was a certain things I decided to aim for, which I thought I'll play those, and it might make it seem like I know the head a little bit more. I could have just funked it all the way through. But I felt with this one, this is where, when we get to the solos, me and Shannon go completely off the scale. Shannon ends up doing 2 solos, which is quite interesting. He does a big solo and he goes all over the place, and then it builds up to a certain point, and then he drops down, and then he builds it all up again. He gets 2 solos on his tune, which is great. I can't believe how Wendy and Martin can pick up, you know, they're basically reading that stuff. And when you hear how accurate they are, it's quite astonishing. We also hear Pat move to electric bass. And what I like about Pat's playing on this, he's not going for a riff-based approach. He's stabbing little bits in. And I think that's the right thing to do, because I'm sort of doing the same thing. And there was a couple of things where I would cut a couple of phrases out because we had it quite gelled. And just by cutting that one phrase out, then all the other phrases worked really well. It's really interesting hearing Martin playing in such a sort of funky fusion area, because, of course, there is a very iconic saxophone player on alto sax in that area, which is David Sanborn. And it's interesting to hear a player like Martin, who I feel is a lot more esoteric, a lot more able to go into the nether regions on his instrument, although Sanborn did a couple of times. But it's also interesting to hear him play in such a funky sound. I think this one is interesting, the way we took it. When I went back to some of the early rehearsals of it, because we had a rehearsal, ran it a little bit, and then we had a break, and then we came back and did the session. The tempos are all over the place. The band, you know, I don't know how fast these are supposed to be. You know, people are playing them at all sorts of different speeds. And also, the tempos vary incredibly within the tunes themselves. That's my fault. But in the end, as I keep saying, I wanted to introduce a little bit of chaos. I'm going to talk about that when we get to the end of the video. Anyway, the next one that I want to talk about is the tune that Martin Speak brought in. Now, the reason I've slowed my speech down is because I can't remember the title of it now. I've got here Mufti something it's called. Mufti. Mufti. I can't remember, but you'll see the title when it starts up. This tune sort of relates to what Canan brought in. Very funky tune. What's interesting with Canan's, it was pretty much just one tonality all the way through. So it's modal. And all the players were able to hint at other harmonic frameworks when they played it. This one is the same. It's modal. It's all over one chord, except there's a B section that has 4 chords in it. And you trigger the end of your solo by going into these 4 bars with these 4 chords in, which is quite interesting. And I felt that was a palate cleanser in terms of the solos. Although it went so far out, I think sometimes people didn't quite know where they were going, because for some reason, even though I'd say this is perhaps the trickiest one to play, there was a lot going on. It's got the most arrangement going on. The head's pretty rhythmically syncopated. But even though it's probably the most densest compositionally, and none of these are really dense, but despite that, we seem to have gone the furthest out on this one, I think. And it really does go all over the place. So the tempo goes up and down. Now, it's very interesting because I'm aware that all the way through these sessions that I was too loud and I need to pull it back. And then when I pull it back, I'm thinking I haven't got the tone. When I played Canan's composition, I was a little bit louder. On this one, I did actually pull it back. In a studio, you don't hear these things so much, but you'll hear that the drum kit doesn't have so much impact. And because of that, I decided not to play too much backbeat, to shift and play all sorts of different rhythms. Now, what would have been great would have been able to have played the rhythms that are in the head, which are in the tune. And there are a couple I tried to pick up. And again, me not being a brilliant reader, I would have needed only a couple of hours to work on it, but I would have needed that time. Now, you could have said, Andy, why didn't you spend the night before learning it? Well, this is something that's at this point in the video, I would like to discuss, but I would like to discuss at this point. Now, this is something at this point in the video I think I should discuss to give you an idea of what's going on here, because it's not just let's get your mates over and play. How can I put this? I think that there is a issue with creative people, musicians. Some musicians are just musicians. They just play. They don't write, they don't compose, they don't have a vision, they just play. And their motivations are to come off very competent, like they can play. Now, you also have musicians who are composers. And when they compose something, they have the idea in their head of how that composition should sound. And they believe, rightly, I suppose, that they, being the artist, should be able to dictate when they, if they can, how it should sound. So they will be giving suggestions to the musicians of how this should sound. Now, with jazz composition utilizes the elements that make jazz jazz. It's like composing, but as well as using chords and scales and different instruments and arrangements and timbre and all the elements, there's 3 other elements that you're going to use that maybe a classical musician wouldn't use. These would be, obviously, improvisation. So improvisation has to occur within the composition, and there's all sorts of different ways that composition can occur. In the 3 compositions we've played here, there's a very straightforward improvisational approach. Firstly, on Stella, it's playing through the form, playing through the chord progressions. On the 2 compositions brought in by Martin and Canan, it's a modal approach. So once you get past the tune, you're basically in just one chord. or you're playing within one scale. You're allowed to impose things on it and travel outside and move inside. But the cadences come from stretching that scale out harmonically. But for me also, it gives you more space to stretch rhythmically, because there's not such a rigid structure going on of going through the song. It's almost like Indian classical music. It's not a drone, but we're just staying in one harmonic place. And the cadences, this is what stretches the music and makes it interesting. Now, there's a very important point. For an audience, what they want to hear is something interesting. But what I've just outlined is that musicians want to seem competent as players, i.e. don't make any mistakes, don't go down any wrong alleys, sound great every minute. And it's a composer, they want their compositions to have the intention that they believe it should. Now, this idea of the artist comes from the Romantic period, which was just a cultural period that existed in the early part of the 19th century. And it comes out of this idea of the artist. So the artist is the great controller of the art that they're involved in. And in being the sort of god of the music, they don't want to appear as though they make mistakes. So when they're working in a studio, without thinking, most musicians will be thinking the goal is to not make mistakes, to play it perfect and have this thing that you can look at. And it elevates you up onto Mount Olympus, and then the people can look up and go, wow, they didn't make a mistake, did they? Now, that's an honourable thing to do. But with the invention of recording as it's developed more and more has been able to make it appear that mistakes haven't happened when they had. But there's a snobbery amongst musicians where they feel, well, we should be able to play it without having to use all this computer technology, right? And look at AI. Well, AI will replicate mistakes or replicate perfection, whichever you want, won't it? So I'm very aware of this, and I'm very aware that if you went back a few centuries from a Beethoven who thought he was the auteur, the author of the music, and that it was his great expression, if we went back to someone like Bach, he would have believed that he was revealing a beauty in the universe. Now, of course, Bach stuff is perfect because it really has its roots in a sort of Pythagorean belief that the universe operates on a sort of numerical system, the music of the spheres, which means that it's everything is sort of happening in these sort of perfect realms. Now, all this stuff is gobbledygook, of course, and the world doesn't work like that. I'm just going to take my jacket off, it's getting quite hot. It doesn't work like that, but, you know, in Western culture, we have this sort of idea, and also because writing's so important, being able to write things down and then being true to the text in front of you. These are all virtues that have come out of Western culture. A lot of the elements that we see in jazz are pulling from folk forms. There is a line of influence coming from Latin America. There's some African influence there, Irish folk songs, European influences. And so jazz is weird, and it's a very sophisticated form of music which utilizes classical technique. And of course, we've talked about the history of jazz here at length. But what's interesting is there's a freedom there, there's a level of virtuosity and technique, but there's also these, what I will call folk form elements, vocalization, blue notes, screeches, skronks, all these types of things that make it interesting. Now, in jazz, the things that really are the things where you'd say this is the unique things that jazz created, it would be, of course, improvisation. It would also be the integration of someone's own sound, and I would extend that off to their own personality. And so you, in a jazz group, you can have opposites. You can have a Miles Davis and a John Coltrane, and you can have all the fluidity and velocity and out there, and also playing for, you know, uneconomic approach of Coltrane, being balanced by the super economic and cool and withdrawn sound of Miles Davis, you see. And often in jazz that works. In a classical outfit, yeah, you could have it, but it has to be toned down a lot, because the musicians are having to create something that the composer can predict, you see. But with jazz composition, it's not like that. We allow for someone to play the melody of a tune and somehow bring themselves to it a lot more. And so when Martin plays Stella by Starlight, he doesn't feel that he actually has to play the tune completely. And Louis Armstrong, back in the 1920s, was a genius at being able to play a tune without being able to play a tune. And when I say this is an innovation, it's an incredible innovation. And I think the idea of having your own sound within a composition is perhaps the most important thing that jazz brought, more than improvisation. Miles Davis in the 1960s, he experimented with a form of improvisation where the lead soloist, the voices of the band, would just play the tune over and over again, but the rhythm section would move underneath it. And it's possible for someone to play a jazz composition where everything's written out, everything's totally written out, and no one's actually taken a solo, but they are still playing and bringing their personalities in. The best way I heard this described is that when Duke Ellington, voices a C major chord, he's not thinking of the first, the third, and the fifth note. He's thinking of Paul Gonsalves and Johnny Hodges and, whoever it would be, Cootie Williams. He's thinking of the players playing that note. He's writing for the player's sound, but also providing the space in the composition for other musicians to be able to express themselves in the future. It's a very complex thing that evolved over the 20th century. Now, the third aspect that jazz brought to music is the idea of groove. Now, a lot of jazz historians will call this swing, but I think swing is just one example of it. And I hear so much boogie woogie piano, for example, and some of the more Spanish influenced music of, say, Jelly Roll Morton, which isn't swung at all. What it does is it grooves. It's got funk. Right, it's got soul. So those are the three elements that I think make jazz what it is, and all of those are actually utilised in a way where four musicians, or in this case 5, can walk into a room like this and never have really met each other, can stare at a piece of paper and then create music that is not on the paper. And that's what you just saw. Now, being a musician, I noticed that there was a process. When people get in the room for the first time, there's a real excitement, and it's like electric, and everyone starts playing, and it's all over the place, and everyone's trying to find each other out and what's going on, and it can be really like electric cable that's been chopped and is now flailing around like a snake. Then, once you get past that, you get into this rehearsal process where people are now, you suddenly get bogged down. You're thinking, oh, we were feeling it when we first played it. But actually, when you listen to it, it's quite all over the place. But now you're starting to try and bring the perfection in. That's a rehearsal process. Once you feel you've got enough perfectionists, then in the old days, what would happen? You start gigging it. So you go out. And I'd find that in the old days, when I was gigging, I could go out, and within 4 or 5 gigs, the music then became second nature. I'm no longer thinking of it at all. It's in my system. And I could play very complex music like that or very simple music. But I didn't have to think about it. And at that point, every now and then, the stars would align in terms of the acoustics in the room, the mood of the musicians, all these things would come together and it would sound amazing. Sometimes when you recorded these amazing gigs, they didn't sound so good. And sometimes when you recorded a gig that sounded a bit tetchy, it sounded a lot better. One of the things I noticed is that when everything feels a little bit tetchy, it actually sounds a lot better. Now, I believe that when musicians first walk in the room and start playing some stuff, they also have that tetchiness, right? They also have that thing where it's not quite right and they're trying to make it work. And that concentration brings out a certain performance. I can say very simply that, to explain what I'm trying to get across now here, if you recorded a band that's been playing a track for a year, night after night, it will have a different sound to when they play it for the first time. So when we walk into a situation like this, we can think two things. We can think, well, what's the point? Really, it would be better if we could rehearse it up and play it a million times and sleep on it and come back and we'd be able to make it really brilliant. But here it's all over the place, isn't it? It's absolutely all over the place. And I know when I'm in a room with musicians that can be how they think. And then Andy Edwards walks in and he won't let you see the charts and he won't really tell you what's going on. Right, and he probably seems to be going for a recording earlier than we should. Maybe we should have rehearsed it more. And then when you're playing it, it's being recorded and filmed. You know, thousands of people are going to watch it, and yet you just made a mistake or something else just gone wrong. And maybe you think, I don't know what's. I feel all insecure. Well, for me, when you have the early part, if you just accept that is the deal and go for it, you can capture something which I believe is more interesting than the playing by numbers. We've played everything and when no one ever plays a bum note and everyone's got it right. And so really the motivation for this video was to do that. And all my videos have this. Every time musicians come into this room to play for you, you are seeing something that nobody else really wants to do because of their egos. They want to get in there and rehearse and perform it, record it a million times, pick the best bits, fix it all afterwards. So, you go on and you listen to, say, Snarky Puppy or Wolfpack or any of these musicians. Now, I'm not saying they're fixing the computer, but they've done so much rehearsing that it's like muscle memory. And many musicians out there will be saying, but that's good, Andy, isn't it? No, it's actually not. It's not good, right? It's not necessarily bad, but it's not necessarily good. Okay, it doesn't mean the music's great. It doesn't mean the audience like it. The audience aren't sitting there going, "Ooh, I want to hear someone play perfect. I want to, see that this person's a wonderful." No, they want to get something from the music and they want to feel something. Now, on this recordings, I am very aware, and it was deliberately manipulated like this, been mixed like that for me, and you got a camera in the room and you're capturing people. I'm hoping that the audience that watch this goes, well, this is really happening in front of our eyes. This is going on. Things are actually going wrong. There's a chance that this could fall apart. And it is sort of falling apart every now and then. It's sort of falling apart. But they're getting it back together. Now, this throws up a very interesting idea. There was a point where I got involved. It was actually with a musician called Steve Lawson. I got involved with a lot of sort of much more freer improvisation a few years ago. And doing that so much, I started to realise that when you improvise in that way, a certain thing happens. You start jamming, you start playing, you're listening, and you're trying to make it perfect. You're trying to make it all homogenous. So you do. And eventually the music comes down and you find this perfect little place. And everyone's playing, they found the groove and it's really happening. Now you have a choice. You can clip that and put those 2 minutes up on Instagram and everyone go, well, that's a cool groove. I really like that. But we should not be interested in music that is only 60 seconds long. So once you've found that place, if you're improvising and you've found that place and it's just sat there now, all perfect, what do you do? If it's down to the musicians to shift it, if the composition doesn't provide an exit strategy, what do you do? And I would get to these situations, I'd be playing and I'd be thinking, well, this is really, sounds cool, but it's now getting boring. And I realised that the only thing you can do at that point is something which is wrong. If you keep adding stuff which is homogeneous and works, you will not create the story of the music going, right, we've gotten to this position, we're now in a safe place. Right, now someone's thrown something in. That pianist keeps banging that chord now. They brought in a chord and it's completely out of tune. And the bass player goes, why is he playing that chord out of tune and at that time? Maybe I can try and find it. And then they find it. And what the audience hear is suddenly this thing comes in, which is chaos. And then the musicians adapt to the chaos, and then they find a point, and then it becomes homogeneous, and it becomes ordered. And then someone else throws something in. So I feel for music, and this is true of all art forms, for it truly to work, you have to add things in that are wrong. And you have to utilize the wrongness. And in doing this, musicians that are in your orbit will become very insecure in the thought that they might not be coming across as perfect. These people have the guts to come here, walk into this room and just play. Now, when the chaos comes in, at that point, AI cannot replicate it. Once it's done, the AI can listen to it. Oh, wait, the musicians did that. Yeah, I could do that. But then the musicians could bring more chaos in. And then the AI will go, well, okay, we'll do that now. Oh, but you brought more chaos in. Oh, yeah, I can do whatever you want. But you'll find that no one is interested in listening to AI music. They're only interested in making it. You know, listening to someone's AI music, someone else's AI music, is like listening to them talk about their dream. No, we actually are sat on an incredible thing now. We don't have to buy albums anymore. We don't have to buy singles anymore. We don't have to listen to stuff on the radio anymore. You can go to the internet, and with the technology we have, even with the low budgets like the budgets I have here, low budgets, couple of cameras, old recording studio equipment, I can bring musicians in and they can play something for you on the spot. And it will be chaotic and it won't represent them being perfect. And then if you like what they do, when you then toddle over to their Bandcamps or their Spotifys and check their music out, I'm sure it'll be perfect. And you can listen to them being perfect till the cows come home. But not here, not on my patch, not here. It must be something else. Now, as we get to the end of the video, I ask you this. Will you please put in the comments whether you noticed that these recordings and these jams are different to what you normally see on YouTube? That you did feel that it was people in the room, and it was sometimes really interesting, sometimes really emotional, sometimes very exciting, sometimes very, whatever. And other times you could feel that we were like, we'd lost control and the horses were running all over the place. And we were frantically trying to pull them back in. And that in itself was compelling. I want to know if you could hear it. Or am I just off my head and I should be here rehearsing so everything's perfect. So you never have to put up with anything that's not in exactly the right place. Like AI created it in a perfect realm. Now, there is another tune. And this one is called AP, A.P. And it's written by Martin. When we would do the sessions, he said, I've got this other composition. And the truth is, it was very hard to play it wrong because it was very, very simple, but very emotional as well. AP stands for Arvo Part, the classical composer, and it explores a certain space and stillness as something that we don't get a lot on this channel. So we started to play it down, and I turned and said, this has got to be recorded. It was actually the first thing we recorded, and it utilised that nervousness that you have right at the start of the session, where everybody doesn't want to play anything wrong, and the music needed that. What you're about to see, I think, was the most successful recording, and I think this is pretty much perfect, although there's a lot of tetchiness going on at certain points in the composition. But I want to end with this. This is AP, written by Martin Speak, performed by Chanan Hanspel, Wendy Kirkman on piano, and Pat Sprakes on, I think he's on double bass on this one. And I want to present to you this in the little bit of sort of musical fishing that went on in this room earlier, of maybe the best fish we caught. You're trying to be poetic. Here we are, built up to the end of a video. Yeah, this. If you imagine that we're fishing for beauty,
in the river of sound, and we cast our nets and we pull up something. Sometimes it's an old shopping trolley, but every now and then a beautiful silver fish emerges from the dark waters of chaos, and we present it to you right now. A beautiful fish, a musical fish that we have catched.
Bye.